In a small farming community nestled among rolling hills, there lived a hard-working farmer who had tended to his land for over 3 decades. His weathered hands told stories of countless harvests, and his gentle eyes reflected the wisdom gained from years of working with the earth. The farmer's property had been in his family for generations, passed down from his grandfather to his father, and finally to him. One morning, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the farmer discovered a registered letter in his mailbox. His heart sank as he read its contents. A large agricultural corporation was claiming ownership of a portion of his land, citing some obscure property records from the 1950s. They demanded he cease farming on that particular plot immediately. The farmer knew every inch of that land like the back of his hand. He remembered helping his father plant their first apple orchard there when he was just 10 years old. The disputed area now housed his most productive fields, providing nearly half of his annual income. Losing it would mean financial ruin. With determination in his heart, the farmer gathered all his old property documents, land surveys, and tax records. He visited the local library, spending hours poring over historical records and property maps. The librarian, who had known him since childhood, helped him dig through dusty archives and microfiche records dating back to the early 1900s. Despite having limited resources, the farmer refused to give up. He sold his prized tractor to hire a lawyer, who unfortunately seemed more interested in settling quickly than fighting for justice. During their first meeting, the lawyer suggested accepting the corporation's minimal compensation offer, claiming it would be impossible to win against their team of high-powered attorneys. But the farmer had a different plan. Years of solving problems on his farm had taught him to think creatively. Late into the night, he studied property laws, learning about easements, adverse possession, and land rights. His kitchen table disappeared under stacks of legal documents and research papers, illuminated by his old desk lamp as he worked tirelessly to build his case. The corporation's lawyers tried to intimidate him with complex legal jargon and threatening letters. They offered settlements that seemed generous to others but would barely cover a fraction of what the land was worth. The farmer stood his ground, knowing that accepting their offers would mean losing not just his land, but his family's legacy. As word spread through the community about his fight, something unexpected happened. Elderly neighbors came forward with stories and old photographs showing his family working that same piece of land decades ago. The local surveyor discovered original property markers that supported the farmer's claim. Even the retired county clerk remembered details about the property boundaries from her early days at the office. The evidence was mounting, but the farmer knew he needed something more concrete to win in court. He remembered his grandfather's stories about a boundary dispute from long ago. This memory led him to search through his father's old belongings stored in the barn's dusty attic. There, in a water-stained leather briefcase, he found something that would change everything, but that discovery would have to wait for the next part of this extraordinary tale. Just when it seemed the odds were stacked impossibly high against him, the farmer uncovered a pattern in the corporation's property claims. Several other farmers in neighboring counties had faced similar challenges from the same company. Each case followed a similar pattern: obscure historical documents, aggressive legal tactics, and pressure to settle quickly. The farmer started reaching out to these other landowners, carefully documenting their experiences. He created a detailed timeline showing how the corporation had systematically targeted small farmers across the region. His kitchen wall became a makeshift investigation board, covered with maps, documents, and connecting threads that revealed a larger story. As he dug deeper, the farmer discovered an interesting detail about the corporation's claimed ownership. The documents they presented had a peculiar flaw, one that only someone intimately familiar with local farming history would notice. The property descriptions referenced landmarks and boundary markers that didn't exist during the time period the documents claimed to be from. This detail might seem small to others, but the farmer knew it could be the key to unraveling their entire case. However, proving this in court would require more than just his word. He needed irrefutable evidence, and that's exactly what he set out to find as the first hearing date approached. The discovery in the old leather briefcase turned out to be more valuable than gold. Inside, the farmer found his grandfather's personal journal from 1948, meticulously documenting every land transaction in the area. The journal included hand-drawn maps, witness signatures, and even pressed leaves from boundary trees that no longer existed. Most importantly, it contained detailed notes about a visiting land surveyor who had created the very property lines the corporation now disputed. With trembling hands, the farmer carefully photographed each page of the journal. The yellowed pages revealed something extraordinary: the corporation's supposed historical claim couldn't possibly be valid. His grandfather had documented a completely different owner for that period, complete with notarized records and photographs of the original fence posts being installed. But the farmer knew he couldn't rely solely on his grandfather's journal. He needed official confirmation. Following a hunch, he visited the county's oldest church, where records of land donations and community events had been kept since the town's founding. The elderly church secretary, who had served there for over 40 years, remembered something about a time capsule buried during the church's centennial celebration. After obtaining permission, the farmer helped excavate the time capsule. Among its contents was a community photograph from 1952, showing aerial views of all the local farms during a harvest festival. The photograph clearly showed his family's property boundaries, exactly as he had always known them to be. More importantly, it showed structures and farming patterns that directly contradicted the corporation's claims. The farmer's next step was brilliant in its simplicity. He started interviewing elderly members of the community, recording their stories about the land. One retired postal worker remembered delivering mail to his grandfather at that exact property for decades. A former schoolteacher recalled how her students had taken field trips to the farmer's family orchard, the very one the corporation claimed hadn't existed during that period. Meanwhile, the corporation's lawyers grew increasingly aggressive. They sent representatives to photograph the farmer's land without permission and tried to pressure his neighbors into signing statements supporting their version of events. But their tactics backfired. The community rallied around the farmer, with many refusing to even speak to the corporation's representatives. The farmer's preparation for the court case became a community effort. Local historians offered access to their private collections. The town's amateur photography club helped digitize hundreds of old photographs and documents. Even the high school's computer science teacher volunteered to create a digital timeline that clearly showed the inconsistencies in the corporation's claims. As the court date approached, the farmer made another crucial discovery. While organizing his evidence, he noticed something odd about the corporation's documentation. The paper they used for their historical documents had a watermark, one that wasn't introduced until the 1980s. This detail might have gone unnoticed if not for his careful attention and the magnifying glass he'd borrowed from his grandson's science kit. The farmer took this information to a paper expert at the state university. The expert confirmed his suspicion: the documents couldn't possibly be from the 1950s as claimed. The farmer now had scientific evidence that the corporation's documents were fabricated, but he kept this information close to his chest, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. 1 week before the court date, the corporation made their final attempt to settle. They doubled their original offer, then tripled it when the farmer didn't respond. Their lawyers hinted at unfortunate consequences if he chose to proceed with the case. The farmer simply smiled and continued preparing his presentation for the judge. The farmer spent his evenings rehearsing his arguments with his family. His teenage granddaughter, who dreamed of becoming a lawyer, helped him organize his evidence into a clear, compelling narrative. She reminded him to speak slowly and clearly, and to explain complex farming terms in ways anyone could understand. The night before the court date, the farmer sat on his porch, looking out over the disputed land. The sunset painted the fields in golden light, just as it had done for generations of his family. He thought about all the harvests, all the seasons, all the memories embedded in that soil. Tomorrow would determine not just his future, but the future of his entire family's legacy. What he didn't know then was that his case would do more than just save his own farm. The evidence he had gathered would expose a pattern of corporate manipulation that affected farmers across 3 states. But first, he had to face the most important day of his life, the court hearing where he would finally present his case against the corporation's team of expensive lawyers. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a soft drizzle that made the farmer's old boots squeak against the courthouse's marble floors. The building's imposing architecture, with its towering columns and echoing hallways, seemed designed to intimidate ordinary folks like him. But the farmer stood tall, carrying a weathered leather briefcase filled with evidence he'd spent months gathering. The corporation's legal team arrived in expensive suits, wheeling sleek cases full of documents. There were 5 of them, all wearing expressions of barely concealed contempt as they glanced at the farmer's worn jacket and muddy boots. They didn't know that those boots had walked every inch of the disputed land, gathering evidence that would soon shake their confidence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with silver hair and keen eyes, called the court to order. The corporation's lead attorney started with a polished presentation, displaying glossy maps and professional diagrams on a large screen. He spoke confidently about property laws, ancient land grants, and legal precedents, using terms that made some observers' eyes glaze over. When it was the farmer's turn, he stood slowly, taking a moment to look around the courtroom. He saw familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers who had come to support him. Drawing strength from their presence, he began not with legal arguments, but with a story. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady, "before I present my evidence, I'd like to show you something." He pulled out an old mason jar filled with soil. "This dirt comes from the disputed land. My grandfather taught me that you can tell the history of a farm by its soil. Every season leaves its mark, every crop, every rainfall, every decision made by the farmer who worked it." The corporation's lawyers exchanged smirks, but the judge leaned forward, intrigued. The farmer continued, "Just like this soil tells a story, the evidence I've gathered tells the true story of this land." He then methodically laid out his findings, starting with his grandfather's journal. Page by page, he revealed the detailed documentation of land boundaries, supported by the aerial photograph from the church time capsule. The farmer explained how the landmarks mentioned in the corporation's documents couldn't have existed in the 1950s, using testimonies from elderly community members to prove his point. The corporation's lawyers objected repeatedly, but each time, the farmer had supporting evidence ready. When they questioned the validity of his grandfather's journal, he produced notarized statements from the County Historical Society confirming the handwriting and paper age. When they tried to dismiss the aerial photograph as inconclusive, he brought forward the former land surveyor who had taken it. Then came his masterstroke. The farmer pulled out the evidence about the paper watermark, presenting the university expert's analysis via video conference. The expert explained in detail how the corporation's supposedly historical documents couldn't possibly be authentic, given the modern manufacturing techniques evident in the paper. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. The corporation's lead attorney's face turned pale, and his junior colleagues began frantically shuffling through their papers. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as she examined the evidence of document fabrication. But the farmer wasn't finished. He revealed the pattern he discovered of similar cases in neighboring counties. 3 other farmers stood up in the courtroom, each ready to testify about their own experiences with the corporation's tactics. The farmer had meticulously documented how the company had used nearly identical forged documents in each case. The corporation's legal team requested a recess, during which they huddled in intense discussion. When court resumed, their lead attorney attempted to dismiss the watermark evidence as circumstantial. However, his usual confidence had evaporated, and his arguments sounded hollow in the face of the farmer's comprehensive evidence. As the hearing continued, the farmer shared photographs of his family working the disputed land over decades, harvesting crops, building fences, and maintaining the property. Each image was dated and authenticated, creating an unbroken chain of evidence showing his family's continuous ownership and use of the land. The judge asked pointed questions about the corporation's documents, focusing particularly on the inconsistencies the farmer had uncovered. With each answer, the corporate lawyers seemed to sink further into their expensive leather chairs. Their polished presentations and legal jargon couldn't stand up to the simple, well-documented truth. Just before the lunch recess, the farmer played his final card. He presented evidence that the corporation had actually tried to purchase the disputed land from his family in the 1970s, a fact that completely contradicted their current claim of ownership. The documentation included rejected offer letters and correspondence that had been carefully preserved in the county records office. The afternoon session was set to begin in just an hour, and the tension in the courthouse was palpable. The farmer sat quietly eating the sandwich his granddaughter had packed for him, while the corporation's legal team huddled in intense discussion with their clients on the phone. Local reporters had begun gathering outside, drawn by rumors of the dramatic revelations in the case. As the farmer watched the corporate lawyers scrambling to salvage their case, he remembered something his grandfather used to say: "The truth is like a seed, you can bury it for a while, but given time and the right conditions, it always finds its way to the light." Now, sitting in that courthouse, he understood those words better than ever before. When the afternoon session began, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The corporation's legal team returned with a new strategy. They called in a surprise witness via video conference. The witness was introduced as a retired record keeper from the state land office, who claimed to have additional documentation supporting the corporation's claim. The farmer watched calmly as the new witness testified about supposedly finding old records that had been misplaced in the state archives. But years of watching the weather had taught him to sense when a storm was coming, and something about this testimony didn't feel right. He passed a note to his granddaughter, who quickly began searching through their carefully organized files. As the witness continued speaking, the farmer noticed something peculiar. The way the record keeper described the filing system from the 1950s contradicted what he had learned during his research. He remembered a conversation with a 90-year-old former clerk who had described a completely different organization method used during that era. The farmer's granddaughter found what they were looking for: an official state document outlining the archival procedures from 1945 to 1960. When it was his lawyer's turn for cross-examination, the farmer quietly handed over the document. The questions that followed revealed that the witness's description of the filing system was historically impossible. Under pressure, the witness began to stumble over details. The judge, who had been taking detailed notes, asked several pointed questions about specific dates and procedures. The witness's answers became increasingly vague and contradictory. Finally, when pressed about his exact role during that period, he admitted that he had only started working at the state office in the late 1980s. The corporation's lawyers quickly tried to redirect the court's attention to their original documentation, but the damage was done. The judge called for a brief recess, during which whispers filled the courtroom. The farmer sat quietly, remembering his father's words about patience being as important in justice as it was in farming. When court resumed, the corporation's legal team attempted a new approach. They suggested that even if there were technical issues with their documentation, the farmer's family might have inadvertently encroached on the disputed land over time. They presented satellite images showing how the property's usage had changed over the decades. The farmer was ready for this too. He retrieved a dusty box from behind his chair, one he hadn't opened yet. Inside were his father's tax returns dating back to 1963, each one precisely documenting the acreage farmed and its boundaries. Along with these were annual crop reports, insurance documents, and even receipts for fence repairs along the disputed property line. More importantly, he had photographs of his grandfather shaking hands with the corporation's former land surveyor in 1965, right next to the property marker they now claimed was in the wrong place. The back of the photo bore the surveyor's signature and a notation confirming the boundary line's location. The corporation's lawyers huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. When they returned to their table, their body language had changed. Gone was the arrogant confidence from the morning. Now they looked like weathermen who had predicted sunshine but were watching storm clouds gather. During the next break, they approached the farmer with a new settlement offer, one that was significantly higher than their previous proposals. But the farmer politely declined. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about truth and justice, not just for him but for every small farmer who had faced similar tactics. The afternoon wore on as the judge reviewed the accumulated evidence. She paid particular attention to the soil samples the farmer had brought, asking detailed questions about farming practices and land use. The farmer's authentic knowledge of the land shone through in his answers, contrasting sharply with the corporation's theoretical arguments. Local reporters had begun gathering outside the courthouse, drawn by rumors of the dramatic revelations. Some of the other farmers who had faced similar challenges sat in the gallery, their faces reflecting both hope and anxiety as they watched the proceedings. The farmer's granddaughter had been taking careful notes throughout the day. During one of the breaks, she showed him how the corporation's arguments had gradually shifted from claiming outright ownership to suggesting possible boundary disputes, a clear sign that their case was crumbling. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, the judge called both parties to her bench. She had noticed something in the original property surveys that neither side had addressed yet. Her question suggested she was piecing together a larger picture, one that aligned remarkably well with the farmer's evidence. The corporation's lead attorney, looking increasingly uncomfortable, requested time to consult with his clients about a potential resolution. The judge agreed to a brief recess, but her expression suggested she had already seen through the corporation's tactics. The farmer stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the evening air. The same soil he had been fighting for was on his boots, the soil his grandfather had worked, his father had tended, and he had protected. Whatever happened next, he knew he had honored their legacy by standing up for the truth. Back in the courtroom, the tension was building toward what everyone sensed would be a decisive moment. The corporation's legal team returned from their consultation looking grim, while the farmer sat peacefully, his weathered hands folded on the table before him. The truth, like a well-planted seed, had taken root and grown into something they couldn't ignore or deny any longer. The judge cleared her throat, and the courtroom fell into complete silence. Even the usual creaking of the old wooden benches seemed to pause in anticipation. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at both parties before beginning to deliver her ruling. "In my 30 years on the bench," she began, "I have seen many property disputes. But rarely have I encountered a case where the contrast between documentary evidence and actual claims has been so stark." She turned her gaze to the corporation's legal team, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge methodically outlined her findings, starting with the questionable nature of the corporation's documents. She specifically cited the watermark evidence, calling it irrefutable proof of document fabrication. She then praised the farmer's thorough documentation, noting how his evidence painted a clear picture of continuous family ownership and land stewardship. But what came next surprised everyone. The judge revealed that her office had conducted its own independent research during the lunch recess. They had discovered that this wasn't the first time the corporation had been accused of using falsified historical documents in land disputes. Similar cases had been filed in 2 other states, though none had made it to trial as the farmers had accepted settlements. "This court cannot ignore what appears to be a pattern of systematic deception," she declared, her voice carrying a weight that made the corporate lawyers stare at their shoes. "The evidence suggests this was not a simple misunderstanding about property boundaries, but rather a calculated attempt to seize land through fraudulent means." The farmer sat quietly, his weathered hands folded on the table, as the judge continued. She not only ruled in his favor but also ordered the corporation to pay all his legal fees and damages. More significantly, she referred the case to the state attorney general's office for further investigation into the corporation's practices. Furthermore, she added, fixing the corporate legal team with a stern gaze, I am ordering a review of all similar cases settled by this corporation within the state over the past decade. Any farmers who accepted settlements based on similarly fraudulent claims should have the right to revisit their cases. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The farmer's granddaughter squeezed his hand, tears of joy streaming down her face. The corporate lawyers huddled together, frantically taking notes and making phone calls. But the judge wasn't finished. She turned to address the farmer directly. Sir, your meticulous gathering of evidence, your dedication to uncovering the truth, and your refusal to be intimidated have done a service not just to yourself, but to rural communities across the state. This case will likely become a precedent for protecting small farmers from predatory land acquisition practices. As the court adjourned, people rushed to congratulate the farmer. Local reporters crowded around, asking for interviews. But the farmer simply gathered his documents, thanked his supporters, and headed for the door. He had evening chores to attend to, the cows wouldn't wait for legal victories. The story spread quickly through farming communities across the country. Within weeks, other farmers began coming forward with similar stories, armed with new hope and a blueprint for fighting back. The state attorney general's investigation uncovered dozens of cases where the corporation had used nearly identical tactics. The farmer's case became a symbol of resistance against corporate land grabs. Law schools began using it as a case study in property rights and the importance of maintaining historical records. Agricultural organizations invited him to speak about his experience, though he preferred to stay home and tend to his fields. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was closer to home. The farmer's granddaughter, inspired by the case, decided to pursue a career in agricultural law. She wanted to help other family farms protect their legacies. Grandpa, she told him one evening as they watched the sunset from his porch, you didn't just save our farm. You showed me that one person standing up for truth can make a real difference. The corporation's reputation suffered significant damage. Their stock price dropped as news of their fraudulent practices spread. Other companies began distancing themselves from similar aggressive land acquisition tactics, fearing similar exposure and legal consequences. Months later, as the farmer walked his fields with his grandson, checking the spring plantings, he paused at the disputed property line. The old boundary marker stood exactly where his grandfather had placed it decades ago. He smiled, thinking about how this plot of land had taught a lesson about justice that no amount of money could buy. Remember, he told his grandson, the land remembers everything we do to it, good or bad. The same is true for justice. Sometimes it takes a while, but the truth always finds its way to the surface, just like these new seedlings pushing through the soil. 1 year after the landmark court decision, the impact of the farmer's victory continued to ripple through rural communities across the country. The state attorney general's investigation had uncovered over 30 similar cases where the corporation had used fraudulent documents to pressure small farmers into selling their land. The farmer's detailed documentation method became a model for protecting family farms. Agricultural extension offices began offering workshops on proper record-keeping, using his case as an example. They called it the generation-to-generation approach, emphasizing the importance of preserving family farming history through documents, photographs, and oral histories. The corporation faced serious consequences beyond the courtroom. Their aggressive land acquisition division was shut down, and several executives resigned in the wake of the scandal. More importantly, other large agricultural companies began reviewing their own practices, leading to a shift in how they approached land deals with family farms. But the most meaningful changes happened at the grassroots level. Local historical societies saw an surge of farmers bringing in family documents for proper preservation. County offices reported increased requests for historical property records as farmers began documenting their land ownership histories. The farmer's granddaughter, now in law school, helped establish a legal aid network specifically for family farms facing similar challenges. Back on his own land, the farmer noticed subtle changes in how people treated him. Neighbors would stop by more often, seeking advice not just about farming but about standing up for what's right. Young farmers would visit, notebook in hand, eager to learn about both agriculture and advocacy. He always told them the same thing: know your land, know your history, and never be afraid to fight for the truth. The local high school invited him to speak to students about civic responsibility and the importance of preserving family history. Standing before the classroom, he pulled out the mason jar of soil he'd shown in court. "This dirt," he explained, "holds more than just minerals and nutrients. It holds our stories, our heritage, and our responsibility to protect what's right." The state legislature took notice too. They began working on what became known as the Family Farm Protection Act, which required stricter documentation for corporate land acquisitions and provided additional legal protections for generational family farms. The farmer was invited to testify during the hearings, though he insisted on scheduling his appearance around his harvesting duties. His own farm flourished in the aftermath of the victory. The disputed land produced one of its best harvests ever, as if the soil itself was celebrating its rightful ownership. The farmer used some of the damages awarded by the court to modernize his irrigation system, but mostly he kept farming the same way he always had, with respect for the land and an eye toward future generations. One cool autumn evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, a young couple pulled up his driveway. They were farmers from 2 counties over, facing their own legal battle with a different corporation. They didn't come asking for legal advice, they came seeking hope. The farmer shared with them not just his story, but his grandfather's journal, showing how the truth preserved by one generation could protect the rights of future ones. The farmer's case became more than just a legal victory, it became a symbol of how ordinary people could stand up to powerful interests and win, not through excessive resources or cunning tactics, but through dedication to truth and careful preservation of history. His simple mason jar of soil now sat in a display case at the State Agricultural Museum, alongside copies of his grandfather's journal and the court's decision, a reminder that the richest soil is the one that holds our stories and our determination to protect them. 5 years after the court victory, the farmer's story had become a cornerstone of rural legal education. Law schools across the country used his case to teach students about the intersection of agricultural law, property rights, and the power of thorough documentation. But for the farmer himself, the most important lessons weren't found in legal textbooks, they were written in the soil he tended every day. Spring came early that year, and the farmer stood at the edge of the once disputed field, watching his grandson plant a new apple orchard. They were using the same techniques his grandfather had taught him decades ago, though now with some modern improvements. The young trees would take years to bear fruit, but that was the way of farming, you had to believe in tomorrow. The Family Farm Protection Act had transformed the landscape of agricultural land disputes. In the past 5 years, corporate land grabs through fraudulent documentation had dropped to nearly zero in states that adopted similar legislation. The farmer's granddaughter, now a practicing agricultural lawyer, helped draft additions to the law that specifically protected historical farming records and family documentation. Local county offices had created a special archival system, dubbed the Heritage Farm Registry, where farming families could safely store their historical documents and photographs. The farmer's grandfather's journal had inspired this initiative, showing how personal records could become powerful legal tools. Every month, more families brought in their own collections of documents, photographs, and hand-drawn maps. The corporation that had tried to seize his land had undergone a complete transformation. Under new leadership, they established a reconciliation program, reaching out to farmers they had pressured in the past. They even created a fund to help preserve family farming heritage, though most farmers noted the irony with a skeptical smile. On warm evenings, the farmer would often find young agricultural students sitting on his porch, eager to learn. They didn't just want to know about farming techniques or legal strategies, they wanted to understand how one person's stand for truth could change an entire system. He would show them the original mason jar of soil from the court case, now accompanied by 5 years' worth of samples, each telling its own story of seasons past. The farmer's methods of documentation had evolved into what agricultural extensions called the living history approach. It combined traditional record-keeping with modern technology, digital photographs, GPS mapping, and detailed chronicles of farming practices. But at its heart, it remained what the farmer had always practiced, paying attention to the land and keeping honest records of its story. His grandson, now studying agricultural science in college, had created a digital version of the grandfather's journal system, allowing farmers to easily record daily observations, weather patterns, and property changes. Yet the farmer still preferred his handwritten notes, believing that some truths needed to be written by hand, pressed into paper just as seeds are pressed into soil. The most satisfying change wasn't in the legal systems or corporate policies, it was in the renewed confidence of family farmers. They no longer saw themselves as powerless against large corporations. The farmer's case had shown them that their deep connection to the land, backed by careful documentation and unwavering determination, could stand against any legal challenge. During harvest season, farmers from across the state would still stop by, sharing their own stories of standing up to intimidation and winning. Each victory, whether large or small, added to the growing legacy of rural communities protecting their heritage. The farmer listened to these stories with quiet satisfaction, knowing that each one represented another piece of land preserved for future generations. One crisp autumn morning, as the farmer walked the boundaries of his property with his great-granddaughter, she asked him why he had fought so hard instead of taking the corporation's money. He stopped at the old boundary marker, now surrounded by thriving crops, and picked up a handful of soil. "This land," he told her, "is more than just dirt and crops. It's the story of our family, of everyone who worked it before us, and everyone who will work it after. Sometimes, standing up for what's right isn't about winning or losing, it's about protecting the truth so it can be passed down, just like this soil, from one generation to the next." 10 years after the landmark case, the farmer's victory had grown into something far bigger than a simple property dispute. Agricultural universities now offered courses in heritage farm documentation, and his case study had become required reading for both law and agriculture students. But on this particular morning, as the farmer walked through his orchard with a news crew from a national farming magazine, his mind wasn't on his legacy, it was on the apple trees his grandfather had planted. The old trees still produced fruit, their branches now gnarled but strong, much like the farmer's own weathered hands. The reporter asked about the court case, but the farmer pointed to the trees instead. "See how these branches have grown," he said, running his hand along the bark. "They don't grow straight, they bend toward the light. That's what justice is like sometimes. It might take a winding path, but it always grows toward the truth." The Family Farm Protection Act had spread to 37 states, creating a network of legal safeguards for family farms. The farmer's granddaughter, now a prominent agricultural rights attorney, had helped establish legal clinics specializing in farm heritage cases. But more importantly, she had never forgotten the real lesson of her grandfather's fight, that the strength of family farms lay not in their size, but in their stories. The corporation that had tried to claim his land had become a case study in business ethics courses. Their attempted land grab, and subsequent transformation, was used to teach future business leaders about corporate responsibility and the true cost of dishonesty. The farmer found this amusing, how his simple stand for truth had ended up in fancy business school classrooms. Local schools now took annual field trips to his farm, where students learned about more than just agriculture. They learned about standing up for what's right, about the importance of keeping records, and about how one person's courage could change an entire system. The farmer always ended these visits at the boundary marker that had started it all, now surrounded by a small garden of memorial flowers. His documentation method had evolved into a national standard for family farm protection. The Living History Protocol, as it was officially known, combined traditional wisdom with modern technology. But at its heart was the simple truth the farmer had always known: that the land holds memories, and those memories need to be preserved and protected. The mason jar of soil from the court case had been replicated in agricultural museums across the country, becoming a symbol of rural justice and preservation. But the farmer kept the original on his kitchen windowsill, a daily reminder that the richest soil is the one that holds our stories. One summer evening, as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, the farmer sat with his great-grandchildren on the porch. They asked him if he was scared during the court case. He thought for a moment, watching the wind ripple through the wheat fields. Being scared isn't what matters, he told them. What matters is knowing what's right and being willing to stand up for it, even when you're scared. The corporate world had changed too. Large agricultural companies now approached family farms with respect and transparency, aware that the era of fraudulent land grabs was over. Some even sponsored programs to help preserve family farming heritage, though the farmer always smiled knowingly when he heard about these initiatives. His grandson, who now managed most of the farm operations, had integrated modern farming technology while maintaining the core principles that had protected their land. Drones mapped the fields, computers tracked the yields, but the most important records were still kept in handwritten journals, a tradition started by his great-grandfather and continued through 4 generations. As the farmer reached his twilight years, he found himself spending more time on his porch, watching the seasons change across his fields. Young farmers still came to seek his advice, not just about farming but about life, justice, and standing up for what's right. He always told them the same thing: the land remembers everything we do to it. Make sure what you do is worth remembering. The final line of his grandfather's journal, written decades ago, had proven prophetic: this land is not just soil and crops, it's a promise to the future. The farmer had kept that promise, not just by preserving the land, but by showing that truth, like a well-tended field, will always bear fruit in its season. In the end, the farmer's greatest victory wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the legacy he created. A legacy that taught future generations that sometimes the most powerful force for justice isn't in legal documents or corporate boardrooms, but in the simple determination to protect what's right, to preserve what's true, and to pass on both the land and its lessons to those who would come after.